Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elaine O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology.
Hi there.
Hi there, how are you?
I don't know how I am. Do we want to talk about that?
Maybe we should.
Do you want to just sit back and be my shrink for a minute?
Sure.
Trust me when I tell you that no one wants that job. Even the people I pay. No, they're like, no, that was nice. That was fun. Good seeing you. Bye.
Bye.
So, no, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah.
Are you going to lie to the people or are you just going to be...
Well, I'm better now that I'm here talking to you. We have a nice glass of wine. What are we drinking, by the way?
We're drinking a Gewürz, and I'm trying to remember where it's from. I don't remember where it's from. Anyway, but it's a Gewürz, and we are recording, and we are actually reflecting on a conversation we had recently, about which we are very excited.
Yes, very excited. So our friend John Pavlovitz joined us for a chat. We were in North Carolina recently, which is his home state. If you're not familiar with John... He has a blog that's pretty successful. He's also a very avid social media person. He's on Twitter. He's an avid tweeter.
He's been on Facebook a lot lately,
too. He's been on Facebook a lot lately.
Yeah.
The thing that John and I, one of the things that he and I have in common is that we both came out of evangelical land. He has been on staff at churches. The last church was he calls it a mega church in North Carolina, where he was on staff as a youth pastor, but had an awakening of sorts, like many of us have, has since left that church and has gone to writing books, the latest of which is called Hope and Other Superpowers, which just came out, the subtitle I love, A Life-Affirming, Love-Defending, Butt-Kicking, World-Saving Manifesto. He also wrote a book called A Bigger Table, which is a fine book that came out a few years ago. And then the name of his blog is Stuff That Needs to Be Said. He's also a contributor regularly to Huffington Post, Relevant Magazine, Scary Mommy, ChurchLeaders.com, and the Good Men Project. So John is everywhere. And we met John at Wild Goose.
That's right.
Last summer.
But we knew of him
But we knew of him lots before that.
Right.
But we got to take selfies with him and talk to him at Wild Goose, which was great.
Okay, to be clear, you took selfies.
I did take selfies.
I am not the selfie taker.
No, you're really not.
I'm not at all.
But we got a selfie of the three of us in North Carolina.
We did.
Recently,
that was lovely.
which was great.
It's on Instagram somewhere.
This conversation with John covers a lot of things that are of interest to all of us, the three of us, and hopefully you. That's the hope anyway. So this conversation that we had with our friend John is broken into two parts. And as many of you know, and if you don't know, you're about to know, we are on Patreon, patreon.com. And Patreon, if you're not familiar, is a way that folks can support their favorite podcasters, musicians, singers, songwriters, artists, etc. So we are on Patreon, and one of the things that we would like to do for our Patreon listeners is offer the second part of this conversation as a gift. If you would like to hear the second part of this episode, we would love for you to go to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/cocktailtheology. And there you will have the opportunity to support us in a number of different ways at different levels. And we appreciate anything that you can do to help us because it does cost money to sustain our podcast, our little enterprise here. We would love your help. What you'll get today is the first part of this conversation. There is a second part, which I promise is so worth listening to and so awesome that you'll want to give. Visit us at Patreon.
Now, I do need to say something here. So I have this feeling, because I haven't listened to part one yet, but I have this feeling that you cut him off mid-sentence and then said, tune in to our Patreon site, same cat time, etc., and gave the thing again. But Patreon, I want to give one more plug for Patreon.
Yeah, please.
So Patreon comes out of the idea of the medieval period of time where wealthy people were patrons of the arts, where they gave money to the arts.
Right.
We've lost a lot of that sense of that, but that's what Patreon's trying to replicate. And, part of it is it's trying to be, if you will, NPR for people.
Yeah.
Right? So you create a pledge. It comes painlessly out of your bank account every month. And you get access to everything that you would have had access to, and you help support us and support other people. So lots of great people on Patreon. Encourage you to go looking around, but really give to us so you can hear the end of the sentence that John was speaking when Benton cut him off.
Yes, that very important thing he was saying.
Sentence.
Right. This is part 1 of our conversation with John Pavlovitz. Hi, John.
Hey there.
It's great to have you with us.
It is so good to be here.
It's awesome to be in lovely Wake Forest, North Carolina.
It is.
It's a crisp day outside, but not nearly as crisp as, say, Chicago right now.
Wait a minute. No. Crisp?
Crisp. Yeah.
You think that's crisp?
More like crunchy. It's
Crunchy.
it's frozen.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, much more like crunchy.
Crisp is like where they keep the lettuce, but,
Yes. But if you put lettuce up there, it's going to freeze.
That's right.
Cook it. I'm just telling you right now.
Yeah,
that's
it
the way
is.
it's going to work. That's the way it's going to work. But
It's actually warmer here than it is in Nashville, so.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
So we're staying here.
My temperature.
That's right.
Okay. So one of the things y'all don't realize is that we are staying in an Airbnb, which is our want when we go on the road.
Yes.
And it's a really nice place. Like, we both walked in and went, okay, we should live here.
Yeah.
This would be good. Could we throw this guy out of his own loft? Yeah.
You're just going to squat here. You're just not going to leave. That's all right.
Thank you.
We'll just broadcast until we can't anymore.
I like that. Yeah, but it's got, it's the exposed brick thing, right? So it's all good.
We are having beverages.
We are having beverages.
Elaine and I are enjoying Prosecco with a pomegranate syrup reduction. And our friend John is a Diet Coke-aholic, self-professed. So tell us about your fascination with Diet Coke. When did it begin?
Well, it's funny. I was on Twitter and I confessed that I've never had coffee before. And everyone just came, they said, we're breaking off the friendship now. I'm not following you, you monster. And,
that's the one that got the most response.
That's right. That's gone viral. And, because I realized culturally that's like I've missed the whole section of life. But really, for me, it's just been, I've had cold caffeine my whole life, and so the soda thing just sort of happened. I'll drink wine with dinner. That's by the extent of it. I've never sort of developed a taste, but the carbonation, it does it for me. I don't know what.
So when I asked you about your preferred beverages, you said Diet Pepsi/Coke. Those are not the same thing. Right.
I believe in a bigger table, so I'm not gonna be partisan in the cola realms.
We were going to lead off this conversation by saying, so we've noticed some really disturbing similarities between you and our president.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Fantastic.
We didn't need to do
that. That might be the only one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we can find.
Yeah, we'll be here a while, so maybe we'll figure something out, find common ground.
It's right. Where do you want to start, friend?
Let's talk about John's book. John, you have a new book.
I do.
Tell us a little bit about the premise for your book, Hope and Other Superpowers.
Yeah, well, the book was born on the book tour for A Bigger Table. As I went to different cities, I started asking people the question, what kind of person does the world need? And sort of listening to the responses, and there was so much commonality in those responses, regardless of people's politics or their theology. So I was hearing sort of these elemental truths, and then I was having a conversation with a friend, and she was really exasperated about everything happening in the world that particular day. We were having a bad day, which we rarely have, and she said, doesn't anyone remember how to be a decent human being anymore? It seems like people have forgotten. And so I kind of combined those things and began just trying to put together something that would be an encouragement to people to just remind them of the best way to be human and the things that we sort of agree on regardless of the other surface differences. So telling my story, but telling a lot of other people's stories as well.
Do you find hopefulness as you're interacting with people? Do you find that there is hope among the people that you interact with, whether it's online or in your personal life? Are you finding hope?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the blessing of being able to travel so often is I get to be in a new community three times a month, and I get to see what's happening on the ground. I get to bring a group of people together who wouldn't otherwise be in the same room, and they look around, and I get to remind them that, look, there are people geographically close to you who share all the, they're asking the same questions you're asking. They're passionate about the same things. And so they begin telling their stories, and there's no way you can leave a gathering like that without being optimistic about what's happening. I did a Q&A, and a guy said, well, there are two news feeds in my life. There's the one that I see every day, and the one that's easy to pay attention to, but then there's this other news feed happening below the surface. And if I dwell on those stories and dwell on those smaller, quieter things, I find hope easy. And so that's really, for me, it's a challenge too, doing the work that I do and the work that you do. You're face to face with all the loud stuff, and that'll always get your attention. And so it's about intentionally just trying to figure out, like, what else is going on here.
It's interesting you bring up the geography of things. So my doctorate's in spiritual formation, particularly kind of in the Renovari, Willard, Strand,
Okay.
Foster, those guys. Tends to attract two very different kind of people. One kind is the people who come out of fundamentalist perspective, whether they are churched or atheists, but still a fundamentalist perspective.
Okay.
Right? Or come out of a contemplative thing, which tends to be more open.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that the fundamentalist people, they feel like there's nobody near them who also cares about the spiritual formation piece.
Right.
Okay? The people who come out of the contemplative area feel like there's nobody around them.
Sure.
And so they're all saying, there's nobody around me
Yes.
who's like me. Right?
Mm.
And I love hearing you say that wherever you go, you get that sense of hope. You get that sense of there being clumps of people.
Yeah.
Because they feel so isolated. I think one of the things that has been so painful about this particular administration is it has fed on isolation. For all of its flaws, the strength has been the sense that you're not, if you're in that camp, that you're not alone.
Right.
You know? Now, for everybody else, it either is, okay, so I'm going to pay attention to none of this, or I'm alone in my own ways.
That's right.
But that feeding on that isolation, that feeding on, I am completely unique, and there is no bridging whichever gap it is. I think that may be the most painful aspect that leads people into hopelessness, is that
Sure.
isolation.
Yeah, and what I started to, as I travel, I tried to figure out what are the themes or the feelings that are rising up, the common themes, and it's really been exhaustion, it's isolation, it's disconnection, and I remind people that regardless of their politics or their theology, they're still feeling that disconnection, those family separations, those odd conversations at work, the sense of estrangement that you feel now around people that you used to feel totally comfortable with. And so that has been, and then what's interesting is people say, I feel like no one is like me, but you see that sense of identity, how tied it is into our politics and our religion, but yet everyone still has the same longings. And that's the one thing I try to have people leave with is the people that you're opposing, they still have those longings too. They still feel like no one gets them.
I wonder if what we all need to talk about is none of this, and just essentially we are all built to be connected. We're built to be connected to God. We're built to be connected to each other. We are by nature a social species.
Sure. And I think the lie that we hear in politics right now is that you are this in-group that is under attack, that you're constantly, there's an urgency all the time because you're about to be overtaken or have something stolen from you. Right. And that's what the evangelical church at its worst does. But at its best, like you said, what it does is it gives you that sense of family, community. I always say organized religion and organized crime are very similar. When
they do it well.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
And then when you're in that thing, you're well loved and you're well fed. And then when you cross that line and you are no longer welcome, it's sometimes complete, disconnection.
Eventually you run into a reality that you're not prepared for. It can be just something I'm seeing here is not jiving with what I thought it should be. And either you change your paradigm or you retreat back into the safety of your old reality, right?
Right.
Now what?
Yeah, like I've often said that in my case, life started to argue with my theology, right? I started to have things that I was seeing and I was saying, well, there wasn't any politician I was opposing. There was no pastor I was rejecting. It was simply those inner prompts that says something is not right here. Right. And the problem is most of us, we are busy and we've got all sorts of stuff happening. You build that little system because it works. It's shorthand at some point. And, I always remind people it's very hard to make time for an existential crisis, right? They'll have the bottom drop out. And so a lot of people do retreat. That's why they do let their pastor tell them or their politician tell them what they believe, because they want that neat and tidy thing.
I think even when they don't want the neat and tidy, they don't know what's on the other side.
Well, for sure.
Not knowing what's on the other side is a terrifying place to be. It's like coming out, right? I mean, it's if you're coming out of any closet, whether it's a queer closet or a reality closet, you have no idea what that step's going to look like.
Yeah,
one of the things I liked about your most recent book was that sense of it is sometimes just the reaching back into the dream that you had. It, from the outside, it seems like a very small thing.
Yeah.
But is massively game-changing.
And for me, I had to realize my faith deconstruction didn't mean that my spiritual journey was over, obviously. That unknown is terrifying, because you not only don't know what's on the other side, you don't know how long it's going to last.
Yeah.
And that's the sense that you keep hoping, okay, I said to somebody recently, I've been doing this deconstruction, if I'm honest, for a decade, and you realize it's never going to be resolved. When you thought it was resolved, that's when you were lying to yourself, and so that's the scary part.
Right. But yeah, that is part of that is a spiritual journey in itself, is just recognizing that the deconstruction is never really fully over.
Right.
You're going to always be confronting these things. If you actually are pursuing God in any kind of real way, you're going to continue to confront these things.
That's right.
About yourself, about your culture, about the world, about your neighbor, about God. You're going to continue to confront them over and over.
Yeah. I had a friend who said she was talking about one of her more conservative cousins, and she said, I just don't understand how someone could believe the same thing they believed 10 years ago, or not be honest about the fact that they don't. So that lack of movement is either a disconnect between people, but it's that thing that paralyzes you. You just say, I cannot find a new belief system. I cannot go there. And a lot of people just won't. Yeah. And so everything that you say, like for instance, my writing is always going to feel confrontational to them. Mm-hmm. So I don't have to attack their theology. I just say, hey, I'm not sure about hell. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I got to defend that, because if I don't, then the whole thing starts to fall apart.
Exactly.
So you become really bad news for people when you're just simply sharing the questions that you have.
Yeah. Yeah, because with some folks in some schools of thought, questions are just bad.
That's right. Exactly. Oh, yeah.
We met through a church that we now no longer work for, and Benton was working for it when I got there, and I wound up joining the staff a few years later. To give that pastor credit, he let me talk. Mm-hmm. Given for a very specific stream of people in that church, the fact that my worldview has lots of facets and that you can see it in multiple ways was groundbreaking.
Well, yeah, it absolutely was groundbreaking. It broadened my views.
Yeah. But it is that, now what? Because when you've got the package, you know what you know.
Yeah. And you learn, for me, even becoming being a pastor, that wasn't my first, plan. The plan was, but when I'm on the new plan, I had to actually learn, or I thought I had to learn, well, how do pastors talk? I looked at all these, I'd go to these youth pastor events and go, they all sound the same. I don't sound like that. And then you learn that, you learn, okay, on this subject, here's what we say, or here are the scriptures we use, or this scripture story, here's what that story means. There's no other meaning. So you just develop this Cliff Notes version of Christianity, and that's what you go with.
Well, and that's true on the far liberal side, too.
That's right. Right.
It's only about social justice. Mm-hmm. And you better find a way of interpreting everything metaphorically.
Right.
Because, and this is the part that always gets me, God may have created the world or been involved in that, but couldn't have managed to put a lot of animals on an ark. Like, like the people who try to explain the ark in this sort of structural sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't get this at all.
Yeah. Or even just to admit that tension is there. Because a lot of people, if they're more fundamentalist, they'll say, well, there is no conflict. They'll rationalize that it all feels easy. Right. And then on the other side, but I've had people, a guy came up to me after an event and he said, well, you've got all this bigger table stuff and you talk about it. I love it. You've got these stories of Jesus from the gospel, but then you've got this idea of the weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so that's really said that it feels really inconsistent. And I said, yeah, that's a problem. I mean, yeah, it is. So that's exactly the point. The point is we're all in that state of tension in some way. Mm-hmm. It's just that some of us are okay with that tension, and some of us that tension is sinful.
So I love the superhero metaphor. I'm a comic book nerd from way back.
You saw there's a comic book store about 30 feet from here. It's great.
Yes, I did. So I love superhero myth. I love when I was a kid. I was always playing superhero in the backyard.
Yeah.
I was always reading the comic books, loving the stories. A few years ago, not that long ago, I started rediscovering some of these things from my childhood that I really used to love.
Yeah.
And realized how connected I still am to those things. Mm. And it brought out in me a youthful curiosity about other things. I loved roller coasters when I was a kid. Uh-huh. You grow up, you get married, you have kids, and it's like comic books and roller coasters are the last thing you're thinking about. And then I went through a divorce. My kids grew up and became teenagers. And then I had the freedom to sort of rediscover some things. And one of the things I rediscovered was roller coasters.
Wow.
And so I remember there was a birthday that I had a couple of years ago, and I was going to be spending most of the day by myself. And so I decided to take a little road trip. And so I went up to Louisville, Kentucky, which is about 2.5 hours from Nashville. And I went to their little theme park, and I rode like all the roller coasters in about an hour.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I can't let this be my birthday. So I drove another hour and a half to Kings Island, where they have like some really legitimate roller coasters. And so I remember, and it was a rainy, dark, stormy kind of day, and I remember standing there in line for my favorite coaster at Kings Island, and just standing there in the rain, waiting for it to reopen because it's raining, and so they're not running it. And I'm standing there in the rain with this huge smile on my face, and realizing how connected I feel to this moment. How, I'm excited like I was when I was 11 or 12 years old.
Yeah.
On a roller coaster. And how I could still feel that way in my 40s, and how I could still relate to who I was then, and actually relate to who I was then in a much more tangible. It was like a string attached from that moment all the way back. There was such a freedom and an innocence about that.
Yeah.
That it sort of opened up some latitude for me to explore other things. And my relationship with God was one of those things.
Wow, that's
sort of rediscovering and grabbing onto a youthful exuberance that I had for God when I was a teenager, and a curiosity about God. Like, I don't have all this figured out, and I don't have all this figured out. It's almost like, it's like play. And
sure.
A lot of what Elane and I do in School for Seekers is about giving people the freedom to just play with their ideas, play with their preconceptions, their misconceptions, all those things, the things that they're afraid to touch, or the things that they weren't afraid of maybe when they were younger.
That's right.
But now that they're grown and supposed to have it all together, they're afraid to touch those things.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what you were talking about, kind of reaching back to that and finding the superhero. There are things that I'm afraid of now that I wasn't afraid of. It wasn't a problem then.
That's
Why is it a problem now?
Well, in writing about the idea of wonder in the book,
wonder's a good word.
Because trying to figure out what does spirituality really look and feel like, and the idea of I call it living on tiptoe, when you're like trying to you're young, you're trying to see this parade and you can't, and you're like you're leaning on things that are stable and larger than you. Living on tiptoe to me is when you begin to have that freedom in your faith journey, you get to say, there is a bigger thing that I can't quite figure out, but it's okay. There's no, the mystery is a joy.
Right.
And so, you're right. When we do tap into that, that's why I have the same superhero memories. It's funny because my son, he's 13 now, but up until maybe a couple years ago, he was still like making superhero noises. So he's in the other room and he's like, and he's jumping around.
Right.
And I thought about that today, that I miss hearing those sounds come from his room. And, but I miss it as an adult too. I miss that idea of just being play and the lightness. So, when we can get a piece of that, it's good.
It is good. And I think that's where hope lives. Yeah. It's in that. It's not, there's not a ton of hope to me in like the structures that I spent years sort of building around myself or surrounding myself with.
Yeah.
There were kind of answers, and maybe there was safety in that box. I grew up in a fundamentalist background, and I think there's a lot of safety in the rules that you create, because all you have to do is just follow these rules.
Yeah.
But when you start breaking all that down and you're given more options and the world becomes broader, it feels like it's scarier, or there are more options to fail, or options to fail God in some way.
Yeah.
And so it all becomes more scary. But I think if you can look at it from more of a childlike view, it's wonder more than it is fear.
Yeah.
I mean, it's curiosity more than it is condemnation. You're not feeling like there are fingers pointing at you saying you need to do it this way.
Yeah, that's the curse of adulthood, right? You know, like I talk about, you know, you go into a kindergarten and you say, who here is an artist? And they'll all say, oh, me, right? Or who here is a musician? Me.
I love that.
And then if you go, you ask a bunch of adults, well, no, or I used to be, or I can't.
Really.
And so that's just, there's a huge part of the adventure of just living that we lose, which as a person of faith, I mean, and you see that in Christianity, well, how sad is that that's the place where all the wonder is squeezed out? It's sort of like wonder that we're going to package for you. This is the acceptable wonder you can have.
But when I think about like the life of Jesus and the way that he taught, there was a ton of mystery around.
Sure.
I mean, he could have just given a bunch of rules.
Yes.
And said, this is the way we're going to do this, people.
Mm-hmm.
But instead he spoke in these parables and he let people draw conclusions, and he didn't script for everybody what their faith life or their relationship with God was going to look like, or who God was. He didn't script for everybody. Here's God.
Yep.
And I give them a checklist of attributes of God. It's like, discover God.
That's right.
God wants to be in relationship with you.
If faith were as easy as people sometimes make it out to be, I think the Gospels would be far shorter, right? Because Jesus would have said, here's your list, and then I'm going to leave now. But, you know.
The fact that we lose the whole Sermon on the Mount, the Matthew version of Sermon on the Mount, when we're talking about what Jesus asks us to do and to think about. Either we look at the hope of the lilies of the field, or we look at, you know, the one feed somebody. Because his way of conversing invites confusion.
Right.
Yeah.
It invites having to sort it out yourself.
Here's what I know you know, or here's what I know you've heard, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, yes, please stop there.
Yes, right, or even, but the treasure must be buried in that field.
That's right.
Give me a freaking map.
Yeah. And I know how I feel about Samaritans, right? So it's all that. It's all this sort of subversive sucker punch of question. Yeah.
When we're teaching Bible, one of the things I try and get people to do is whenever it says fear the Lord, you know, those who have fear of the Lord, and change that to awe. Yeah. Because awe is open and wide. And you should be looking at God and going, whoa. Right. And if you don't have a whoa response, you're not paying attention to God. Yeah. But it's not about quaking your boots. That's right. Yeah, and I think that's what you see. The worst of religion is when God becomes something to be terrified by. You know, we talk a lot in the Q&As after events, and people they say, how do I understand this person who's got this theology? And I explain to them, when you are raised for decades with that definition of God and the image of a God who is out to squash you, you feel there's no way to get around that. So to give them another opinion is to argue with God, and you can't win that, you know? So that's really sad when God becomes that punishing force. One of the things I find challenging in your book, the most recent one, is the focus on the moment, my particular moment in the world that I either grab or I don't. The problem that I have is that so many people, particularly men, particularly in the evangelical world, have been brought up thinking God has one thing for you to do. And if you don't do it, God just kind of steps back and goes, well, you know, John, this was the will. This was the one. Now you've got the won't of God, yes. Right? I think there's a lot of undoing of that, again, particularly for men, that thing that there's one thing you're supposed to do, there's one place where you're going to be a superhero. That's right. And if you miss it, your hero days are over. Yeah. How do you work with that sense of you are the one who has to do something against that, and if you miss it, it's all shut. Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the idea of being present is a really powerful thing. So to realize that this moment is as full of possibility as any other moment. There's an urgency in this moment only that you're present for it, but it's not a pass-fail either. Someone talked about, hey, are you on plan B now? I said, I'm on plan Q. Right. So, and that's okay. And if I miss opportunities,
it's still going to lead me somewhere. Like, even if I feel like, oh, I would have liked to have acted in that moment or spoken, you can only look back and say, how did this shape me? I can remember just wanting to take another job and deciding between two jobs. And I over spiritualized it so much because I thought, God is dangling these choices. Like, John, is it door number 1, 2, or 3? And you torture yourself with everything. And then you learn how big and expansive God's will would have to be for God to be God. And you can choose within that. It's freedom to fail.
Talking against the blueprint model of God, I always say, do you really think God is so uncreative that if you say no,
that's right,
God just goes, oh, well, that's gone.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Shut it down, everybody. give him a coronary. He's finished.
Exactly. Yeah, we would have been shut down on page 4.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, you guys not going to work.
Exactly. Yeah. God, to be God is a very creative artist and can, and can course correct as well.
Some of our folks are like, oh my God, you're talking to him. And some are like, huh?
Who the heck is this? Yeah, I mean, life began for me in Syracuse, New York, a fairly traditional Italian Roman Catholic family. I always say I was raised on gluten and guilt. So here we are eating bread. I grew up in a Catholic family, had this idea of God, this sort of large God, but then a God who knew me and intimately and loved me. But as I got older, I kind of drifted from that system because I wasn't seeing really Jesus in our local faith community. I wasn't seeing an expression of that. Went to college in Philadelphia to study art, graphic design, and really just my world opened up, because of diversity and poverty and all these things that I was sort of shielded from. And it really just expanded everything the way I saw the world. And then 10 years later, found myself serving in a local church just as a volunteer, and then getting offered a part-time position and a full-time position, and finally leaving that Plan A career, jumping full-time into ministry. And then it really was a process of the deeper I got into the church, the more outward success I had, the larger the congregations, the more I started to have these tensions between what I was feeling, the person I was supposed to follow, I thought, as a follower of Jesus, the way I was supposed to be, and the pastor I was expected to be. So that tension was, you've got this amazing career as a minister, you're in this beautiful church, you're well loved, you're doing great things in the world, but then you're feeling, but I'm not saying everything. I'm starting to soften my convictions, or you see how beholden you become to a local faith community. So the short of that was, I just started to say those things. I started to share my theological doubts. I started to ask why the church was so toxic to so many people. Then I came here to Raleigh, and 5 months into my time, I always say I heard God calling me to leave the church already, and came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, "You're fired." And a couple weeks later, I write a blog post called "If I Have Gay Children." Right. That goes viral, and really everything just blew up from there, as far as once I could ask anything as a minister or just as a follower of Jesus, people connected to that. People found the writing. And really everything since then has been trying to figure out, all right, where is this all going? I'm getting up every day and just doing what's in front of you and meeting people. And
if you had actually heard God's call to be a graphic designer, because God was saying, "No, John, I told you."
That's right.
Catholic graphic designer, were you not listening? Jesus is still here.
The Last Supper, you could have done the next one.
The last after the last.
The really Last Supper.
The really Last Supper. How do you think God would have worked through your life in that way? Speculate. This is.
Yeah, no.
And I'm not going to hold you to this tomorrow.
No, I'm fully confident that God was working even in those moments. So, I still look back in those times when I was living in Philadelphia for years, where I was in other people's stories, and I was developing this sort of expansive heart. So, and I even think about right around the time I got fired, I was working part-time as a personal trainer, and realizing that in the gym, I was having as deep connection with people, spiritual conversations, authentic relationship, and that is as real ministry as anything I've done as a pastor.
Wow, yeah.
That's the other lie. The other lie is, okay, if I want to do something spiritual or for God, I got to go to seminary or I got to be in a church. So that's ridiculous. I'd be totally confident that I'd be doing work in the world that was redemptive. Just it would look very different.
Sure.
as I mentioned, I grew up in a fundamentalist denomination, and I was kind of a shining star in this particular denomination as a kid. And I, about 16 years old, I felt that big scare quotes call into ministry, or that God wanted to do something unique or special with me. And so as a 16-year-old boy in this particular denomination, I assumed that meant go be a pastor. And to be a pastor meant going to, that denomination's college, following that up with seminary, and then becoming a pastor at a local church. And so that was sort of my plan. And so I didn't really consider any other options, any other schools. There's a school right there in Nashville. So I went, enrolled there as a pre-seminary theology major, and got 1 quarter in. And I remember saying to my roommate, if I have to be like these pompous assholes, then I don't really want any part of this. And quickly changed my major. I don't remember feeling a ton of remorse about that either. I was also writing songs. I had a band. I've been writing songs since I was 15. And I felt fairly confident that God was working through my music. And when I would give concerts and I would play or sing at church, that was meaningful for people. And so I just believed, well, maybe I just misinterpreted what God was trying to say, and maybe music's more like what I need to be doing. And so I continued to pursue that, not academically. I got a business degree from my mom at a different school, a state school, which actually broadened my views a ton. But I kept writing songs, and I kept getting better at that, and really made music my ministry, which it has continued to be a huge part of the way that I can impact the world in my own way. But I came from that school of thought that there's one road. If you don't walk it, then you screwed up royally. And I don't know. I guess I made my peace with that.
But it is such a great story, because it is that I'm looking at the edges of the round hole or the square, the square hole, and I'm not that.
Right.
I
was not that. In many ways,
I
was not that. I didn't really realize how many ways until later. But yeah, I think a lot, particularly men, as you mentioned, deal with that idea that there's one thing that you're called to do, one thing that you're supposed to do. At this point in my life, I'm convinced that God doesn't care how I earn money, as long as I'm not hurting somebody else or being immoral or hurting myself. But He doesn't care if I'm delivering pizzas or making coffee for people or working at a hotel or, building a house. It doesn't matter what I'm doing to pay my bills and feed myself.
That's right.
What matters is who I am and what kind of person I am and how I'm interacting with the world that I come into contact with every day. And that's my ministry, and that's my calling.
People who have a wider understanding of faith need to learn to be louder about that, to be unapologetic about that, which I think we have got a gap nationally. You hear a lot of voices who are, your Jerry Falwells, your Franklin Grahams, and they've always been there, but there are very few voices saying, hey, there's a different kind of Christianity here.
Right.
You have to find ways to talk about love. You have to find ways to talk about the common good. That piece is central. That sensibility is such a tough one. And I think it's about building your character so that it becomes natural rather than something you have to think about all the time.
Yeah. Well, and it is. And then the challenge for a lot of people who are maybe more left-leaning spiritually, theologically, is that you've got to figure out how much you're going to give your attention to fighting injustice, and how much you're going to invest in caring for people. And that includes the people you disagree with, right? So that's a hard place. It's a hard balance, because I remember I wrote a blog post called Trump Supporters, Can We Talk? And it was trying to explain to someone, hey, I'm actually in this, opposing this person because I care deeply for you and your children more than this person does that you're supporting. But I had a lot of people from the left come and say, well, wait a minute, this seems like you're coddling this. So that's the other reality of doing this work, is that there's always going to be someone who's going to perceive you as damaging. Yeah, and I think that, when I was released from being part of a denomination, part of a local community, there was that sense of, okay, well, there are some things I'm going to say, and you don't do them. You're not trying to be irresponsible and live without accountability and all those things. It's just there's a purity sometimes to what you can say. You don't have to censor it, so yeah, beauty there.
So John, tell us about what's next. What are you working on right now?
Well, right now I'm working on an Advent devotional for next year, and it's tentatively titled Low, and it's about all the times in the gospel stories, the low nature of a sadness, of suffering, of Jesus being born into the low places, of the idea of when you're low, when you're kneeling in prayer, you're low when you're serving someone, you're low when you begin to show compassion for someone else. So that's what I'm working on that right now, and then just traveling. I'll start up this week and just be on the road a lot of the year, but it's a beautiful place because I get to have conversations like this with a couple hundred people, and we just leave feeling encouraged. The first time I did a date, I think it was in Chattanooga, and someone came up to me before and she said, I've driven 4 hours to be here. And I thought, well, why? who else is speaking?
Yeah, I like Chattanooga.
Rob Bell's here. That's exciting.
Yeah, Rob. We've all done that.
But for me, I realized she wasn't there to see a celebrity. She was there because something I'd written let her know that someone understood her, and she knew there were going to be like-hearted people in the room, and so she wanted to be in a place where she was understood and heard. And that's, in doing this work, that's the other part. They know something about me. I know nothing about them other than the words have reached them. And so when we do have time, I try to honor that and say, okay, I'm going to only get 45 seconds with them. Right. I really need to listen and be available. So it's a joy.
Where else are you finding joy? Besides the out in the world with people who are suddenly discovering they're not alone, where else are you finding joy these days?
I really enjoy being a dad. Like, people say that, and I don't know of all children, but I really love being with mine. I just enjoy their company, and I just find that.
It's like that.
Yeah,
I don't understand.
That's right. That's right. Well, I just see people who have 4 and 5 children, and I'm saying, what? I love my children, but I love because there's only 2. And someone said to me after we were pregnant with our daughter, and they said, is 2 enough? And I said, 1 was enough. I have more than enough. That's great.
This is double.
Yeah, that's right. How abundance. That's right. But for me, we cook together, the kids and I, and things like that give me joy, really. And because I do travel, normalcy is. You get it and you think, oh, this is great. Like, this weekend is one of the few that I'm not on the road, and I just go, oh, we get to have an ordinary Sunday. That gives me joy.
What's an ordinary Sunday look like?
Well, Well, it depends on if it's football season or not, I'll be honest. Since it's not now, they'll be grieving because it's a Super Bowl Sunday, but my Eagles are not involved. So, but really, it's really making breakfast. It's being slow. It's not caring that everyone has showered, or not caring that anyone, what we have to do that day usually, other than, being at church. It's really just to have the luxury of slowness, the luxury of not having everything planned, because the way my life is right now, you know how it is. You've got to have a pretty regimented life. Right. So unstructured time gives me joy.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a faith, and you can define this however you like, do you have a local faith community that helps sustain you, that you guys are part of, whether it's
sure.
gym, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, our church is, I'm not on staff there only because the traveling became what I've been doing, but that's the beautiful part. When we have a home church, my family's there. If I'm not traveling, I'm there, but if I'm traveling, I know they're there, and they're, well loved and plugged in. That's the other challenge, though, of doing this work. It's when you're home Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and maybe parts of Monday and Friday, you have to make sure that you're intentional about connecting with the community. I saw a touring musician, and he said, I gave it up because I realized I had no friends. Yeah. That he had friends, but he could never really have substantive time with them. Yeah. So that's the other part about it, is making sure that you're figuring out that balance. Because when you're traveling, you are not in authentic relationship with people, even though they're pouring themselves out to you.
Yeah, it's much more therapist priest than it is.
Yeah, it's accelerated intimacy. It's like, hi, welcome, have some food, and let's bare our souls.
Yeah. Which is like growing up on the West Coast, honestly.
Yeah.
What's one thing you want our people to make sure that they know about you, your work, your spirituality, the heavy bag that you've been using, whatever you want?
My gosh. Well, I always remind people a lot that what happens in life is what looks like anger is actually grief. And, I think if you're a compassionate person, if you're a person of empathy, these days cannot help but affect you. And so, I just remind them to keep hearing other people's stories, because that's what changed me. I didn't just go, okay, I think I'm going to derail my whole spiritual journey and be progressive. Yeah, some people do, but for me, it was, I got to know people, and those people's stories changed me. Absolutely. And I think that's what we have to keep doing, even with the people we disagree with. So I just hope they do that.
Anything you want to ask us?
How long are you staying in town here? Are you leaving pretty soon?
Tomorrow night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we just came in for you.
I'm honored. I really am.
It's an amazing apartment.
Yeah, I know. I'm barricading the doors as we speak. No one's getting in.
Thanks, John.
Hey, this was so much fun. This will be great. To come back, I'll be living here, and you guys can come visit me anytime.
This is now my place.
Yeah, that's right.
If you want to spend some time here writing, we'll leave for a day or two. You can have it.
Don't make me blog about you. So just let me have it and just go along your business.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you spending this time with you.
Thank you.
And that's part 1 of our chat with John Pavlovitz. Part 2, of course, is over at our Patreon site. That's patreon.com/cocktailtheology. If you'd like to hear more interviews like this, let us know. We would love to know who you'd like to hear us chat with and what kinds of questions you'd like us to ask. We do this for you guys, and so we would love to know what you'd like to hear. Till next time, catch you later. Bye-bye.